Okay, so let's read this here. Guzik says, from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem. By the way, notice it's restore and build. We could say the restoration took place as early as when Cyrus was given the command in Isaiah 44 and 45. God prophesied that Cyrus, 200 years before Cyrus was even born, God prophesied that Cyrus would be the one to break the exile. And so thus in 538 BC, Cyrus was the one that triggered the end of the 70-year exile and to allow the people, he broke Babylon's yoke, King Nebuchadnezzar's yoke, and allowed the people to begin to have a freedom with a view towards going back to the land and rebuilding their temple. And so in Isaiah chapter 44 and 45, very briefly, I'm not going to turn to them here, Isaiah records that God promises and prophesies in advance that Cyrus was his anointed, his chosen, to bring about the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. And yet, historically, Cyrus only gave a decree to restore the temple, meaning the restoration and rebuilding of the temple took place actually prior to the restoration and rebuilding of Jerusalem. But nevertheless, Cyrus kind of got the ball rolling with allowing the children of Israel to be set free and to begin to have a view towards going back to the land. So he's an important figure in the whole story. But when we talk about the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, we don't see that actually happening until Artaxerxes hits the scene, and that's around the 557 mark, or something that like what Brother Alan Parr mentioned. Not the 440, but let me show it to you. This one, I'm sorry, not 557, the 457 mark. And so by that time, Artaxerxes has a decree issued to rebuild and restore Jerusalem, but only the temple is written in the decree. But by the time we get to the 444s, then the city and the temple are in view, and it perhaps isn't listed in the decree that we see in the Bible, but definitely the letter that Nehemiah carried has that permission there. He has that understanding. So that's why I said it's either 457 or 444. Germane to our study here is that Guzik reminds us that Gabriel revealed to Daniel the starting point for the 70 weeks prophecy. There was a command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The language about Jerusalem in there is the part that triggers most Bible commentators to choose the 444, the last decree that's ever been recorded that Artaxerxes ever issued. After that, there's no more historical decrees that we are aware of. Therefore, this is the earliest date. I'm sorry, this is the latest date it could be. After this, there's nothing else. So it could be as early as Cyrus, but as late as Artaxerxes. And that's why most people pick Artaxerxes, because the language about restoring and rebuilding Jerusalem, right? Not just the temple. Guzik's going to bear this out. The Bible presents 4 possible decrees that might fulfill this description. Cyrus made a decree giving Ezra and the Babylonian captives the right to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple in 538 BC, whether we can read about in Ezra. That's 1. Darius made a decree giving Ezra the right to rebuild the temple in 517. We can read about that in Ezra. That's 2. Artaxerxes made a decree giving Ezra permission, safe passage, and supplies to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple in 458. That's also recorded in Ezra, so there is a decree there. And then the 4th one, Artaxerxes made a decree giving Nehemiah permission, safe passage, and supplies to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the walls in 445. And that's recorded for us in Nehemiah. And Guzik reminds us that only the last of these 4 decrees was a command to restore and build Jerusalem. The first 3 each focused on the temple, not on the street or on the wall. And I might add, if we look at the very first one that Cyrus talked about, that's recorded for us in the book of Ezra, this one right here, it is true that from a biblical record in the book of Ezra, we only have the temple being the primary one that should be in view to be recorded. Cyrus made a decree giving Ezra and the Babylonian captives the right to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Notice, return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, but not rebuild and restore Jerusalem and the temple. It's a subtle difference, but it causes some Bible students to say, well, based on the Isaiah passages in Isaiah 44 and 45, where God talks about Cyrus being his anointed who will rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, then this is the date that we should choose. But again, I think based on the lack of complete evidence or total detailing about both Jerusalem and the temple, I think this is part of the picture, but it's not the decree that we should be looking for. I vote again for either one of the last two, either the 458 date or the 445 date. And again, there's only a difference between 12 or so years, 12, 11 years, depending on how you count the years there. Not a huge deal. So, point B from Pastor Guzik. Unto Messiah the Prince there should be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Again, this is a big issue when it comes to, is Jesus this Messiah spoken out about in verse 25, or is it a different person such as maybe Ezra or Cyrus or Nehemiah, right? These are different candidates that show up in the different translations or different perspectives. Again, rabbinic perspective is obviously this is not Jesus in verse 25 of Daniel, this Messiah figure that shows up after 7 weeks or after 49 years. From their perspective is either Cyrus that's spoken about in Isaiah 44 and 45, or it is Ezra himself, or some other king or something like that. So, but they're definitely not going to say it's Jesus for two counts. One, they reject Jesus as Messiah for messianic reasons. And two, they say, well, Daniel's prophecy says that this Messiah will show up after 7 sevens or 49 years. So that's much too early to fit the bill for Jesus. But Guzik reminds us that no, the punctuation can allow for the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks to show us 483. So he says, Gabriel's message to Daniel was simple and striking. 483 years, that is 69 units of 7 years, would pass from the time of the command recorded in Nehemiah 2 unto the appearance of Messiah the Prince. And again, this is extremely important theology. If you're a Christian, are you going to take Jesus out of the prophecy, or are you going to put him back in the prophecy? We already know historically when Jesus showed up, and we know from the New Testament writings that he is the Messiah. So therefore, the biblical version of confirmation bias, which is good to practice, remember we talked about that earlier in my study, go back and listen to the earlier parts of this study, confirmation bias from a biblical perspective allows us to see that Daniel was prophesying about this Jesus. Or if we say that it's a different figure other than Jesus, then all we're doing is simply saying that there's a type of messianic person who shows up earlier, but that the Messiah that shows up in verse 26 that we're going to read about here in a moment, the one who's cut off, he is definitely Jesus, no mistake. Pastor Guzik's point number point number 1 under this topic right now. Some say the 483 years were completed at the time of Jesus' birth, 5 or 4 BC. There's little chronological support for this date. Point number 2, some say this is Roman numeral 2. Some say the 483 years were completed at his baptism at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, if dated AD 26. This is possible if one begins with the earlier decree of Artaxerxes, like Brother Alan Parr did in the 530s, in the 557, and figures with our present measurement for years, 365 days to a year, instead of the ancient measurement of 360 days to a year. Again, there's a significant author that we'll read about here in a moment that did a bunch of the calculations, and then another significant Christian author who followed up, an historian that followed up and kind of fine-tuned the earlier gentleman's calculations, and we see that they both still work out to around the same time frame. Point number, Roman number 3, some say the 483 years were completed at the triumphal entry of Jesus, if dated AD 32. The first significant gentleman, as mentioned, his name was Sir Robert Anderson. Significant work, The Common Prince, followed this argument in great detail. And let's see, it might mention the other gentleman. Bullet point under that Roman numeral, Anderson using a 360-day year, which Israel used in Daniel's day, calculated 173,880 days from the decree to the triumphal entry, fulfilling the prophecy to the day. And Walvoord notes, it's customary for the Jews to have 12 months of 360 days each, and then insert a 13th month occasionally when necessary to correct the calendar, which we also recognize. Another bullet point, the year AD 32, based on Luke 3:1 for Jesus' death, is controversial. Most chronologists favor AD 30 or 33, but recent attempts have made some case for the date. And then we have another quote from Wood. A recent article attempts to give credence to the date of AD 32, and that's from a book that's referenced or a journal that's referenced. The evidence presented is worthy of notice. And then a final bullet point. No one today is able to dogmatically to declare, no one no one today is able dogmatically to declare that Sir Robert Anderson's computations are impossible. That's Walvoord, the classic eschatology teacher, end times teacher. And then now we have Roman numeral 4. Some say the 483 years were completed at the exact time of the crucifixion. This is a minority opinion. Most who find the date near this time also see it belonging to the triumphal entry, which happened 7 days before the crucifixion. Point number C, Dr. David Guzik. We're still looking at verse number 26 in Daniel 9. Until Messiah the Prince. Taking Anderson's calculations as reliable, we see a remarkable fulfillment of prophecy. A Gentile king made a decree, and 483 years later to the day, Jesus presented himself as Messiah the Prince to Israel. Point number 1, Roman number 1. In our mind, a prince is a good step lower than a king. In the Hebrew vocabulary, prince has more the idea of strong, mighty ruler than son of a king and heir to the throne. So the word prince there doesn't necessarily have to mean royalty in this passage. It could be, and with Yeshua, there is a heavenly royalty, right? He's the son of God himself. And since God's the great king, this would make us Messiah, son of God, and prince. Of course, we also know that Jesus is the Prince of Peace. But the point being brought up is that the word prince doesn't always have to connote royalty. It's simply idea of strong or mighty ruler. Point number 2 here, Roman numeral 2. There was only one occasion, this is a quote from Newell, there's only one occasion in our Lord's earthly ministry on which he is depicted as presenting himself openly as Zion's king, the so-called triumphal entry, which is the ending point of the 483 years, if I may add. So it's recorded for us in each one of the Gospels, fulfilling Zechariah 9:9 and Psalm 118. Another quote, on that day, Jesus deliberately arranged the event to present himself as Messiah. That's Guzik's remark there, according to the book of Mark. Guzik also notes that on that day, Jesus welcomed praise instead of quieting it. And on that day, the triumphal entry, Jesus made special reference to the importance of that day per the book of Luke. And then Roman numeral 3, this prophecy is so specifically fulfilled that it has been a significant testimony to many. And then we have a quote from Trapp. Others of the Jewish scholars, by the evidence of these words, had been compelled to confess that Messiah is already come, and that he was that Jesus, whom their forefathers crucified, based on this prophecy, which is fantastic. Point D, under Pastor David Guzik's commentary that we're working from here. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. This indicates, Guzik says, that the rebuilding of the streets and wall of Jerusalem would happen in the first 7 weeks mentioned, then would follow another 62 weeks of years until the coming of Messiah the Prince. So Daniel's breakdown, even without our fancy punctuation, really still gives us an understanding that's consistent and harmonizes with the classic traditional understanding of the passage that Jesus shows up after the 483 years. Guzik's point, Roman numeral 1, the 70 weeks are divided into 3 parts, and then he's got a few bullet points. We've got 7 weeks of 49 years until the city and its walls are rebuilt. Then we've got 69 weeks, which is 7 plus 62, which equals 483 years from the decree until Messiah the Prince appears. And then we've got the third unit of a final 70th week to complete the prophecy. This breakdown is very important, and where we put the Messiah in the breakdown is extremely important for us as Christians. So, again, you're going to read these commentaries online, watch YouTube videos, and they're going to say, well, Daniel probably said, and according to the way the Hebrew breaks down, and according to the punctuation of the Hebrew, and it's best to understand that after the 7 weeks, the Messiah shows up, etc., etc. I'm here to tell you that, number one, the original Hebrew had no punctuation other than what the Masoretes inserted using dots and dashes after the fact, and or the way consonants worked against certain nouns, consonants against certain other nouns, and there's possibly a break, but either way, we're still talking about the Messiah showing up after 430 years, which both history confirms as well as the New Covenant. So get your confirmation bias in order there. Point number 4, starting with verse number 26, we're in David Guzik's commentary, reading through our own notes here for this particular study. Point number 4, which starts with verse 26, what happens after the first 69 weeks? And again, even if verse 25 is ambiguous with a Messiah figure showing up too early, like the Jewish model says, there's no ambiguity here in verse 26 because it says, Daniel records, after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Well, this means that if Judaism is correct, that there's a prior Messiah who shows up after the first unit of the 49 years. This second person here in verse 26 is definitely a different Messiah because no one lived to be 483 years long back in those days, right? Because it definitely says after the 62 weeks, this Messiah will be cut off. So you understanding my time frame? If he showed up after the 49 years and then another 462 years later, he gets cut off, and the word cut off there in Hebrew refers to execution or some type of physical death usually, well then this Messiah lived much too long, right? What human person lived that long? So even if Judaism is right, which I think they're not, that this Messiah shows up after only the 7 years, first 7 units, 49 years, then how do they make sense of this other Messiah? They have to bring in two different Messiahs, which I know what they do. They say, according to Rashi, they say, well, the first one was Nehemiah or Ezra or somebody like that, or Cyrus. And the second Messiah, from their perspective, it's just an anointed one. It's not Christ. The second Messiah, the anointed person, that is just King Agrippa or Herod or Nero or some other ruler that lived in the first century. So that's what they say. They still say it's not Jesus. So, but what does Guzik say? Let's read Daniel's prophecy first. After the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. The end of it shall be with a flood. And till the end of the war, desolations are determined. And I think what I want to do, since we're right at about the hour-long break for this particular study, and we only made it through one verse, right? There's 4 verses in question. Daniel 9, 24, 25, 26, and 27. We did verse 24 last week, and we just looked at verse 25 this week. Let's stop right here. And this would be poised for verse 26 next week. I thought we were going to finish this, but there's just much more material that I don't want to rush through it and lose you in the discussion. So this will be the end of our study for tonight. We'll pick this up next week right here at point number 4 with the verse number 24 from Pastor David Guzik's commentary to Daniel chapter 9. But that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events.